And there's all sorts of changes that occur in the visual system as a result of that. People see better in the dark, generally speaking, right? Because we don't, right now we're in a habit. We don't realize we're in a habit pattern. We turn out the light and we're like, of course it's dark, right? I turn out the light, it's dark. When I don't want it to be dark, what do? I turn on the light, right? But if you don't have that sense, if really that goes away at a very deep level, everything is self-luminous to varying degrees at any given time. Yes. And it turns out you're able to function much better in the dark because it's not dark to you. It's still self-luminous. It's just the lower amount of self-luminosity. And people stop, running into stuff in the middle of the night when they get up to pee. And that's how they notice these things, They don't knock over things that woke up their spouse and gotten crabbed at as much, in the middle of the night. And then it dawns on them, why aren't I doing that anymore? And they realize, gosh, I can see a lot better in the dark now.
Welcome to Letting Go and the Greatest Secret, where we explore the end of your suffering and the beginning of lasting happiness. I'm Hale Dwoskin, and today I'll be joined by Dr. Jeffery A. Martin. Jeffery Martin is a social scientist, technologist, and entrepreneur who specializes in advancing personal transformation. For over a decade, Jeffery has conducted the largest international study of fundamental well-being, or higher states of consciousness, known as enlightenment and non-duality. His work helps people obtain profound psychological benefits in a rapid, secular, reliable, and safe way. Jeffery has authored many books, including The Finders, which explores how to make the shift into fundamental well-being. For those, Jeffery, who don't know what you do, can you explain what you do and how it all kind of came about, the pedigree of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Years ago now, really 20 years ago. Gosh, you don't want to think like that. But about 20 years ago, I'd done a lot of stuff. I'd been a pretty successful entrepreneur. And I just wasn't as happy as I felt like I should be. I'd tried every personal development course you could, and I tried to buy my way to happiness in every way imaginable. And it just didn't seem to be working out for me. It seemed like I wasn't unhappy, I wasn't miserable or in some existential crisis or whatever, but I was working a lot every day, and I'd done what the world had told me I should do in order to be happy. And it just didn't seem fair to me that there seemed to be a lot of other people that were happier than I was. So the type A back then, that was me, set out to basically figure this out and become the happiest person in the world. I didn't want to just get happy, right? I wanted to beat everybody else. I wanted to be happier than everybody else. And so I set out to do that. I quit everything that I was doing, and I basically went back to school and picked up the research skills. At that time, I had master's degrees in technology and management and stuff like that. And I went back and picked up scholarly degrees, to do scientific research, and just set out to find the happiest people on earth and research them and figure out if I could engineer a path to them. Mm-hmm. And the group that wound up rising to the top is one you're very familiar with. And it's people who have purported to have some sort of persistent awakening or enlightenment or non-duality or, unity consciousness, persistent mystical experience, you name it. We have over 200 terms, close to 300 terms cataloged for this all around the world at this point. And so we really began, I had plenty of money to, put into the research. And so we really became the first seriously funded research effort into this across traditions and cultures and all of that, probably ever. And here we are, started really around 2005. We always say it started in 2006, but of course, there's pre-work, right? Yes. And so here we are all these years later, and I'm still doing it. I thought for sure I'll just take a couple of years off. I'll do this research, I'll figure it out, and then I'll go back to building companies. And I just never did.
So how has it affected you?
Well, it's definitely the smartest thing I ever did. It's paid off in spades for me. We wound up really creating the first cross-cultural and pan-tradition psychological map of this territory. We did that more or less to figure out how to do neuroscience on it, like EEG and fMRI and things like that. People often, they'll watch like 60 Minutes or they'll watch some show and there'll be some cameraman shooting over the shoulder of some, neuroscientist. And that person will be like scanning through the brain and it looks like, oh, you just take a picture of the whole brain and this magic information falls out of it, but it's not like that. When you're trying to figure something out about what's going on in someone's brain, you have to devise really clever experiments long before you do the imaging and incorporate that into the measurement. And so it takes 5 to 7 years to just figure out what and how you're going to measure the thing that you're trying to get at if you're in a very novel area. And so in those 5 to 7 years for us, what we did was we went around and we basically wound up in a way, accidentally creating this classification system for what we call persistent non-symbolic experience academically, or fundamental well-being in the public space, but it's just catch-all terms for what I mentioned earlier, things like enlightenment and non-duality and persistent mystical experience and stuff like that. So we created this classification system for it. And then, the day came, we did the neuroscience, and then the day came where we thought, boy, it would be really nice to get before and after changes for this, not just bring people in and measure them after they've been in it. But of course, it's all expensive. If you think about, you could spend thousands and thousands of dollars just on a single subject to do neuroscience type stuff, right? So you can't have people failing. You can't like pre-measure 100 people and then send them to some retreat and have nobody wake up, or have 1% of people transition or something like that. Or you just go broke doing a project like that, right? And so we had to come up with a protocol that worked to transition people. So we did that. And then we were able to measure before and after. And so that's kind of what we're known for. We're really known for a few different things. We're known for the map of the territory, so to speak, which, went across all the different religions and spiritual systems and different cultures all around the world and stuff like that. We're known for having created something that, transitions more than half of people that try it in a fairly short period of time, basically at home these days. And we're known for then studying the changes in those people over time. So what happens after you transition to fundamental well-being? What does that developmental path look like for a person versus a normal developmental path, which is very well studied. We know all the schools, institutions are all built around that stuff, right? But if you transition to fundamental well-being, there's very little that was developmentally known about that. So that's what we've been working on for all these years.
That's cool. That's cool. And what was the biggest surprise in all this?
Oh boy, there are so many surprises. When I first started this, people were like, "You're never going to find any of these people. There's hardly any of them." And we found, of course, the exact opposite, that there's lots of people out there that experience this. We've had thousands and thousands of research participants over the years. And even in the earliest phase, we had about 1,200 people participate all around the world who were experiencing some form of this. And recently, when COVID hit, we were doing brain zapping. So we were doing transcranial ultrasound and kind of infrared light headsets and stuff like that. And we were trying to see, can we just skip all of the other ways that we've been helping people to transition and, put something on their head and push a button? Well, obviously COVID hits and nobody can come into your lab, right? And so we're like, okay, now what are we going to do? It's going to probably be a while. So, we should figure out what we're going to do over the next year. We thought it would probably be a year over the next year, since we can't do what we've been working on for the last several years. And what we decided to do was shorten the protocol. So we'd known for a long time. By this point, the protocol that we used to research people to help them transition, it had kind of been a backwater, forgotten part of our project, frankly. All the cutting edge stuff was zapping people's brains and doing all this cool new stuff. And so we kept it running. We kept it collecting data, but it was always sort of like, some research assistant from the lab in the corner, keeping the thing going with us not really paying much attention because the data was reliable. It was always said the same thing. The same number of people transitioned. They had the same amount of happiness increases. It was just nothing new or interesting there. But we knew something about that protocol. And that is that for the most part, the first, say, 10 different things that we had people do, those things transitioned about 60% of the people who took the protocol. And overall, about 70% of people who took the protocol would transition each time, right? And so the vast majority of people really came out of a pretty small part that was early on the early side of the protocol. And we thought, well, what if we just like get rid of everything else and we just make it a much shorter protocol instead of it being 4 months and 3 hours a day of work? What if we make it, 6 weeks and an hour and a half a day of work? It'll be a lot more accessible to people. A lot more people can do it. And so we started right at the beginning of COVID, once we saw the mental health numbers, like thinking we should do something like this and see if it works. So we ran an experiment. I think 1,000 people or something did the first couple, which were in the first couple of weeks that we were doing it. And to our surprise, 65% of people wound up transitioning on average, which was a huge surprise. So it was more than we thought it was going to be. But even more interesting was that half of the people that came to do that experiment were already in fundamental well-being and they didn't know it.
Yes.
So they showed up to try to transition, right? You say it's common. Yeah. Tell me, what's your experience with this?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting that well, first off, I want to define something.
Yeah.
To see if we're talking about the same thing.
Sure.
Again, I've been doing this since 1976. So with probably not with all the rigor that you have for sure, but certainly experientially, there have been many thousands of people who've gone through what we do. And the transitioning into something where there's a consistent state of well-being and happiness is extremely common. I don't really know the statistic, but it's very, very high. But I've recently started to see that that's just the beginning. That's just a starting place. A lot of people think that's the ending place, but that's really just a starting place. And that which is called by all these names is actually something simpler, more immediate, and more natural than just being a lot happier all the time or feeling a sense of well-being all the time. That's great. And that's still what a very high percentage of the people who get really involved in what we do experience. But many of them couldn't even tell you when it started.
Right. Totally.
It just is what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And so and there's also this habit pattern in the mind to want to know it, to want to experience it. But it's not really something you could know or experience. It's just something that is.
Right.
So it's fascinating to me that you've done all this study of it. It's pretty cool, actually.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, it's been it's been amazing. It's been an amazing 20 years almost. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. And in your interviewing of people, was there, tell me about the model you have too. You have a model of that there are different levels. There's certainly levels of well-being and peacefulness. And a lot of people who teach non-duality, they're teaching being just basically aware of awareness. That's the vast majority of people who are teaching. And that does have levels to it. That is, but it's still a personal experience. It's still, there's still someone there having the experience. When that drops away, all the benchmarks disappear. And so first off, have you studied the people who well, actually most, I don't know, the people from Tony's lineage, it's not real lineage even, but you know what I mean? The non-dual speakers, have you studied any of them or no?
Yeah, we've made a pass through the non-dual folks. I think in 2008 was probably the first time that we made a very concerted pass through them, and everybody else, Christian mystics and Islamic Sufis and Jewish mystics, some shamanic and very, sort of nativist or animalistic systems and lineages, Buddhism, obviously, in its various branches, Hinduism in its various branches. We've been around.
Yes. But again, there's a when you talk about non-duality, there's a vast group of people who talk about non-duality as
and whole religions.
And whole religions, actually, yes. Well, at least parts of whole religions. But it's presented still in a quite dualistic way. Have you studied the people who are talking about it not as a personal experience too?
Oh, sure. I think that's one of the most interesting things is how many different expressions of non-duality there really is. So if we look at our sort of our classification system, if you will.
Talk about that, because you've mentioned it a few times, and you're assuming everybody listening knows what it is. Why don't you tell us what that is?
Yeah, sure, of course. So we have these days it's a two-axis system primarily. And so there's an axis, you think of the x-axis and a y-axis. The x-axis is the first thing that we really released because almost nobody seemed to know about it. And it's really relates to rewiring that happens in the brain. So when you hear spiritual teachers say things like, oh, it's always like this, there's nothing to realize. Well, it's not always like this. It really does relate to changes in your brain, and rewiring in your brain. So the x-axis are different types you can think of fundamental well-being, and we can go through those. And then the y-axis is essentially layers of depth within a given type of fundamental well-being. And so the x-axis, we call them locations along a continuum. So for a long time, we just talked about a continuum, not a matrix, because we were just trying to get people to sort of absorb one concept at a time, and they didn't know about this one at all, it seemed like. So it seemed like the place where sort of ethically we should start in terms of information dissemination. And so we talked a lot about the continuum of fundamental well-being, and that has quite a number of different types of fundamental well-being on it. So we called them locations along a continuum because we did not really like the idea of hierarchies, of thinking of as one being further or better or whatever than another one. Like many systems prefer levels and things like that, but we were trying to get around the levels thing. And so we thought, well, we'll just make a continuum with different spots on it. Now there is a progression to them for sure, right? We could have called them levels if we really wanted to. We just wanted to have people think about them in a slightly different way than they had, than maybe they were traditionally trained to in the spiritual space, So the first location is often overlooked by everyone. And it's really the starting point of fundamental well-being. And it's basically a change deep down, a rewiring in your nervous system, deep down towards a sense that everything is somehow fundamentally okay. Now, what most humans have is a sense that things are fundamentally not okay. Right. And that makes a lot of evolutionary sense if you think about it. Like in our brains, there's a certain brain rhythm that goes back and forth every so many seconds that gives us this sense that it might not be okay. And we probably better check. Is the ceiling falling in? Is a wild animal running at me? I mean, it's just evolution, and all animals have this. If you throw a crumb to a bird, what does the bird do? It's not like a crumb and it just jumps right on it and it starts savoring it. It ignores its environment. It gets eaten by a cat, right? It sees the crumb and then it looks around like, is it safe to take a peck of the crumb, right? And then when it's convinced that it's safe to peck the crumb, right? Pecks at the crumb. And then it looks around again while it's chewing the crumb, right? Is anything going to kill me? Nope, I'm still safe, right? And this is just stuff that's wired into us as animals. The thing that seemed to really significantly change in people that had transitioned to fundamental well-being, even at this most basic level in location 1, as we call it, was the sense that somehow in this moment, instead of something probably being wrong, right, and having all of the fear and nervousness and worry and all of these other things that come out of that, instead there's this sense deep down that everything is somehow okay. Now, that doesn't mean in location 1, which is a shallow form of fundamental well-being, that if your wife or husband comes home and says, I'm leaving you, I'm taking everything, I'm taking the kids, that you're not like having all sorts of, positive and negative emotions going on at a more shallow level of your system. It can seem like, oh, wow, this is not good. And you can have a lot of fear come up, and you can have a lot of triggers and psychological survival stuff and whatever come up. But if you can stop yourself in the middle of all of that and look down very deep inside yourself, paradoxically, at the same time, there is this sense that somehow everything still seems okay. And that might not make any sense given what's going on in your life at that moment, but it's still there deep down, right? And so that's the big change. There are other changes that happen with location 1. Oftentimes the mind will begin the process of getting quieter. It's mostly self-referential thoughts that are quieting down. So thoughts about yourself, basically, which are for most people, like, 90+% of their thoughts are about themselves.
Yeah.
And so, so those
for most people, for most of us, we're even when we're watching the news, it's about us.
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely. It's everything. All of those thoughts are about us, right?
Yes.
And that all comes from something could be wrong in this moment. Got to evaluate, got to constantly evaluate it in relation to us, right?
Yeah.
It can be something as simple as, gosh, should I have worn the blue jacket? Maybe Hale is more relaxed and casual. Maybe I shouldn't have worn a jacket. Or maybe blue, maybe he has to think against blue. What if Hale hates blue? Oh my, or somebody's watching that's really important that's watching this podcast hates blue. Oh my God, I could just turn them all off. Right? And so there's all these neurotic thoughts that are going on in people's heads over silly stuff, right?
Yes.
Oftentimes. And that just basically starts the process of tamping down. There's psychological triggers, of course, that we all have. Nobody knows how to press those better than, parents or a spouse or something like that.
Sure.
And so, they go to press those buttons and they don't quite work as well as they used to work. They press the button and they might get a reaction, but it's less of a reaction. You might notice that there's a reaction, but that it falls off much more rapidly than it's ever fallen off before. So there are changes like this that occur. You can have a sense that you're, larger than your body, that you're not just maybe confined to your body, which can seem a little strange. You're not quite sure what to make of that. There's all sorts of different things that go along with location 1. Location 2 is where non-duality first enters the picture. It's kind of a non-duality light, but it's actually the form of non-duality that most of the teachers that you're talking about are referring to. Right. And so we do a perceptual test for this, and we just ask people, to do one of a couple of things. People that are listening to this can do it right now to see if they've maybe missed the fact that they're non-dual, because a lot of people actually have. So a very simple test for this is you can just ask yourself, you can close your eyes sort of, and then open your eyes. And when you open your eyes, ask yourself, how am I seeing? How is sort of the visual world appearing to me? When I open my eyes, is it all just sort of showing up? It's all just here. Now, I'm not saying it has to be like there's a process. Oh, I see it fading in. I see it showing up, right? There's a magical process where I see the world materializing. Nothing like that. Is it all just here? When you open your eyes, is it all just here? Or does it feel like there's something in your head somewhere? I don't care where. It can be behind the eyes, back of the head, center of the head, top of the head. I don't care where it is. But there's something in your head and it's looking out. It feels like it's looking out your eyes. And it's clearly here. And what it's looking at is clearly out there. If you answer the second one, you're not experiencing non-duality. But if you answer the first one, you're experiencing some form, could be light, could be very deep, of non-duality. We can do the same thing with hearing, whether there's a hearer or whether all sounds are just sort of showing up. And so these very simple perceptual tests that we've learned to do over the years can help people to figure out whether they're experiencing non-duality or they're not experiencing non-duality, because it's fundamentally easily detectable at a perceptual level. It doesn't have to be mystical or magical or anything.
Yeah, I mean, none of
like
this
that
really is mystical or magical. It's just what is. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's the big hallmark of a transition to location 2 or being in location 2. And you can land in any of the first 4 locations. So you can go from egoic consciousness right to location 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. You don't have to go through some sort of progression. Yes. We've never met anybody who's landed in location 5 or later. So there does seem to be something about people landing primarily in the first 4 categories of the experience. Your thoughts, the self-referential thoughts, they're even less in location 2 than location 1. The triggers less in location 2 than location 1. There's other changes like that do seem to be a progression of some kind. If you're very deep in location 2, you'll probably have either very little emotion, or you might just have a very positive emotional state. And then location 3 is really sort of the classic end of the Christian and Abrahamic and some Buddhist and not too much on the Hindu side, a little bit on the Hindu side traditions, where there's a single emotion, actually. It's kind of like a meta emotion that is comprised of 3 things. It's comprised of an impersonal love, an impersonal joy, and an impersonal sense of compassion. And at any given point, one of those is more forward. So you're not experiencing them all equally at the same time necessarily. You might feel like it's 90% the impersonal love, but the others are still there. The others have to be there for you to be in this location. There might be other ones that are mixed in. That are culturally programmed or programmed by your religion or spiritual system or something, that are extras. But those 3 are going to be there. You feel like there's a sense of union with something. Now, you might have a divine version of this, or you might have a panpsychist version of this. If you have a divine version of this, then you feel like there's a union with the divine. If you have a panpsychist version of this, and you feel like there's kind of a union with sort of an all-pervading consciousness, if you will. Location 3 is actually dual again. It's very subtly dual. Yes. Because you can't be in union with something that,
right.
You're
right,
still 2 things, right? It's you and something you're in union with. Right. And then location 4, and of course you still have this further diminishing and self-referential thoughts, and you have an absence of personal emotion really at that point, and it's only impersonal, and that type of thing. Location 4, you have a complete loss of emotion, even love and things like that. They're all completely gone. You have an absence of agency. There's no sense of agency. There's no sense of the divine or no panpsychist sense. There's no sense of agency. I mean, there's literally no sense that you can do anything or make a decision. It just feels like things are synchronistically unfolding. You're as surprised at what's coming out of your mouth as anybody else. You're kind of following along and thinking, wow, that was really stupid, or that was really brilliant, right? But except there's also no thoughts. Right. That you're actively thinking. There, you can perceive a layer where there are thoughts, but it's sort of like you're an observer of that thinking layer that is just sort of thinking on its own, and you couldn't, interject something into that thinking layer, yes. Even if you wanted to. And so those are the core locations. Vast majority of people are in location 1, and then fewer, but still more people in location 2 than 3, 3 than 4. And so on. And there's a big gap between 4 and 5, and things start to get more esoteric after location 4. And location 4, people already say, I feel like I'm an alien. It's sort of like location 3 is like the peak humanness, and location 4, you're sort of falling off into this whole other thing,
Yes, definitely.
So that's the continuum. And then each one of these has a layer associated with it. And the layers are going to sound really normal to anybody that's in the spiritual space and has watched a lot of people's videos and stuff like that. So layer 1 is more or less mind, really. And it has all the tendencies of mind. There's a difference between a mind in location one and a mind that's egoic, right? So it's a finder version of a mind, right? It's a fundamental well-being version of mind, but it's still nonetheless mind. And then the second layer really relates primarily to, if you had to say a phrase for it, it would be like an all-pervasive, spacious emptiness, that type of thing, right?
Yeah.
As that transitions to the third layer, that emptiness becomes fullness, and then in the third layer of depth, you basically have an all-pervasive fullness, is a good way of thinking about it. And it can feel like an all-pervasive sort of field that permeates everything. And that's these are very short descriptions for, there's a shallow version of each of these and a mid-range version of each of these and a deeper version of each of these. There's sensing them and then experiencing them and then identifying as them. So there's all sorts of additional complexities to these. And then the fourth layer is really, it's really sort of what you were talking about, I think, probably early on, where it's just really, there really isn't another word for it than just this.
Right.
It's just this, or people often say that until I ask them, why do you say that? Why not this? And they're like, I don't know. This is better. You're right. I should say this. There's something inherent in people's language capabilities.
Yes,
and you even see it in like Nisargadatta book, I am that, right? Or it's
right.
I am this. But when people really think about it, they're like, no, yeah, it should be this. I should be saying this, right? It's just this. And there's no self-reflection. There's nothing to reflect upon. There is just this. It's not I am this, right? Because the I am is something that would be reflecting on this. Yes. Even the I am this, the I am has to go away. It's just this. So that layer is actually pretty hard to define and talk about in like a single sentence or something. But so you get these combinations, right? So you can be in location one at layer one or layer two, harder to be at layer three, almost impossible to be at layer four. In location two, you can really be look at layer one, two, or three. You get glimpses of four. You can be temporarily in four. It's very hard to root into layer four. Very, very few people do it. Some people do it. And that's the traditional non-dual world. If you go to, the Science of Non-Duality conference and listen to those speakers, or you just, you immerse yourself sort of in the non-dual world, basically they're talking about location two, and they're talking about climbing the layers. Basically what they're fighting about is whether layer three is the right one or layer two is the right one. And they don't know anything about, location three or, location five or whatever. Occasionally a location four person will sneak into that type of conference, or a location three person. They'll kind of be a pariah, like everybody else is.
Yeah, especially location four.
I remember seeing Gary Weber speak there one time. He did this whole talk about location four, and everybody was just sort of like, what is this guy talking about? He just went back to his hotel room alone. He wasn't swamped by people like the other speakers. It was really interesting. Okay, so basically that's the story. You've got these combinations of X and Y axis, and they give you these different experiences of fundamental well-being. Sure. You can experience more than one layer at a time. You can integrate all of the layers even and have a non-dominant layer type of perception. You can be fluid, so you can hop from, most people like from traditional systems, it's all about like rooting into the deepest place that you can get to or something like that. But you can actually be very fluid, and you can have your system hop around and be optimized. So, like right now with you, it's probably best if I'm not in location 19, right? Because I wouldn't be talking much. And so, it's more appropriate that I be down somewhere in location 2, right? So good to have a flexible system that can hop around these things for life.
Right.
Anyway, so that's a story.
Yes. So what's beyond 4?
So beyond 4,
you said the first 4 are ones that people can find themselves in, and I would assume with or without any kind of process or practice or anything. It's just what is.
Yeah, it can certainly just happen to people in a random. I tell you, I think more people wake up actually from suicidal depression than probably anything else.
Right.
And that's tragic in a way. And it's a very small number of people who the razor blade is right at their wrist, right?
Right.
And then boom, suddenly they have a transition. I mean, there's some famous ones of those. You could probably say Eckhart Tolle is one of those.
Yeah.
There's other ones that are very well known.
Yeah.
Even though there's so few people that happens to, and we should not condone suicidal depression anyway.
Yes.
And if anyone is listening to this and they're suicidally depressed,
Yeah.
they should
So,
absolutely
we're
know
not
it is not
endorsing
to be
suicide.
regarded as a path to awakening or anything like that, right? Just to be very clear on this podcast. Nonetheless, a small number of people wind up like Tolle,
Yeah.
And there's just so many people that are massively depressed. There's way more of those people than there are who are actually trying to wake up. And
absolutely.
I think you just wind up as just the outcome of a numbers game, with that being the path for probably humanity at the current moment to transition to fundamental well-being more so than anything else.
That's true. The vast majority of people on the earth are probably in apathy, grief, and fear. That's the vast majority. I would say 98%.
It's tragic.
Yeah.
No, it's really tragic.
Yeah.
There's something about the self-objectification that occurs, we think, in the suicidal depression that enables a small percentage to transition. If you think about, you have to really sort of isolate and be willing to operate on yourself to kill it. And so in some sense, it's a powerful tool of self-objectification that people can sort of accidentally fall into. Again, not recommended.
Right.
Not a reliable path. More reliable that you're going to go the other way, and just die. Right. So definitely not worth that risk.
Yeah. So what's level 5?
Location 5, the hallmark of location 5 is, it's okay, everybody does that. The hallmark of location 5 is, so at between 4 and 5, there's kind of a fork in the road. And what happens in location 4, when someone first transitions to location 4, is usually it's a mix of the top part of layer 3, which is that kind of all pervasive field thing, and layer 4, which is this, right? And what happens over the course of their early time in that is their system goes through a deepening where layer 3 generally falls away, and they just sort of deeply root themselves in layer 4. And so they just have a deep sort of layer 4 experience. And that's the first place where really layer 4 is the home layer, you could say, of location 4. Layer 3 is really the home layer of location 3. Layer 1 and 2 are home layers, 2 more than 1, but it can also be 1 in location 2. And really layer 1 is the home layer of layer 1. And so when you get to location 4, you have this process that takes place, and you sort of deepen into layer 4. And then after location 4, one of a few things happens in location 4. Either people reject it. Their system just is like, this is, where's the love for my child? They're convinced something has gone wrong, and they kind of pull themselves out of it, either all the way out of fundamental well-being or into earlier forms of it. Mm-hmm. Or they just, maybe they're like a Kashmir Shaivist or something, and they're like, this is everything I've ever read about. I'm staying here, right? I've made it. I'm rooting in here, right? And then some people accurately also detect that this is kind of a transitional place and that they can go further. So there's 2 different paths further. There's a single path up to that point. After that path, there's 2 different paths. We call them the path of freedom and the path of humanity. The path of freedom continues to look a lot like location 4. So it continues with no agency, no emotion, all of no sense of the divine, all that type of stuff, right? No thoughts, essentially, no self-referential thoughts. You can still think, obviously, you can still plan, whatever else, still planning that happens and whatnot. You don't necessarily feel like you might be planning, but planning is still happening. Those types of thoughts are still there, but the self-referential thoughts are largely fallen away. Yes. So that would be the path of freedom, sort of a more pure location 4 type expression continued on and deepening. The path of humanity brings back in part of layer 3. And we see this especially in the West. When people, get to location 4 and there's no love, if they have a very strong belief in love, or it's just too alien, it's too not human for them, then they can kind of bring a little bit of layer 3 back in and yet still move further on the continuum. And when they do that, we say that they go onto the path of humanity, right? Because in a way, they're kind of returning to some sense of humanness, right? Nothing like it would have been in location 3 or something like that. But, at least it's not like totally devoid of, everything. And so the path of humanity doesn't go very far. You can't, because the later locations really rely on increasingly rooting deeper and deeper into layer 4, and even some layers that are beyond layer 4. You can't, if you're holding yourself at layer 3, as you're progressing forward, it just doesn't allow you to go as deep.
That becomes an anchor.
It becomes an anchor. Yeah. And so you can go to 5 and 6. But you really can't get to location 7, 8, 9, so on. Whereas on the path of freedom, you can. So the hallmark that we look for at location 6 is actually a change in the visual system. Now, if you know anything about the brain, a lot of the brain is involved in the visual system in some way.
Yes.
And so it's not surprising that as you're going through each one of these locations, you can be in location 2, right? And be completely convinced that and you listen to these non-dual teachers, they are, right? They're completely convinced that there is no ego left. There's nothing, there's no individualized sense of self left. It's all just non-duality. They don't know they're in non-dual light, right? Let's say they then transition to location 4. Well, during that transition, like this whole piece of their individualized sense of self that was hidden from them becomes revealed and falls away, right? And they're very much like, whoa, like where did that come from, right? I thought I was done. I was maxed out in this non-dual thing. And now I realize I wasn't even close.
Before you get to that,
thing keeps happening.
So isn't that one of the places that people get caught? They think they've arrived somewhere.
Absolutely.
If there's someone who thinks they've arrived somewhere, that's
a telltale sign that you have not.
Exactly. And it doesn't matter what level it is. It
doesn't matter.
Right.
There doesn't seem to be an end to this train. So then when you go from 4 to 5, same thing. In location 4, you're completely convinced that you're done cooking. There's no possibility that there's anything left of an individualized sense of self thing or to fall away or whatever else. And then you go to 5 and something does fall away. And it seems to start impinging upon the parts of you that were tied up very early in life with your visual system. And the way we like to think about it is like this. It's actually really quite interesting. So we don't think about the fact that we are effectively just habit systems. Brain-wise, our brains are just forming habits all the time, right? And all they're doing is they're trying to conserve energy, right? Our brain uses more glucose than anything else in our body. So despite that, it's trying its best to conserve the amount of energy that it's using at any given time. And the way to do that is by making things habits as quickly as possible.
Yes.
And so everything.
Most things are on automatic.
Yeah, most things are on automatic. We can't even imagine how many things are on automatic, right? You look at a young kid and they can barely stand up, right? And we're able to stand on balance boards and, surf and stuff, right? The difference between those two and the amount of things that have become habituated to go from A to B is just way more than we could ever list or imagine. And then we just take it all for granted. One of the things that we seem to take for granted is causality of light. And so, we've just learned over the years that when we turn out the light, the room gets dark. Oh, the light bounces off there's a light source. It bounces off the wall. That's how light works. If you don't have that causality of light deep in your system as a habit, it turns out that everything just sort of looks self-luminous, right? If you today forgot that it's light bouncing off stuff that makes something able to be seen, and that just goes away in your knowledge base, and you look at something, you would just assume the light is emanating from the object. And so what happens in the transition from 4 to 5 is that habit system in the brain falls away. for people. What's actually falling away is whatever piece of sense of self was married to that. Because as we're developing as young kids, our individual sense of self is being married with all kinds of other stuff, sensory learning, motor learning, and including things like this, knowledge that, light reflects off stuff. And there's all sorts of changes that occur in the visual system as a result of that. People see better in the dark, generally speaking, right? Because we don't, right now we're in a habit. We don't realize we're in a habit pattern. We turn out the light and we're like, of course it's dark, right? I turn out the light, it's dark. When I don't want it to be dark, what I do, I turn on the light, right? But if you don't have that sense, if really that goes away at a very deep level, everything is just self-luminous to varying degrees at any given time. Yes. And it turns out you're able to function much better in the dark because it's not dark to you. It's still self-luminous. It's just the lower amount of self-luminosity. And people stop, running into stuff in the middle of the night when they get up to pee. And that's how they notice these things, They don't knock over things that woke up their spouse and gotten crabbed at as much, in the middle of the night. And then it dawns on them, why aren't I doing that anymore? And they realize, gosh, I can see a lot better in the dark now. But aside from the dark, it's just things seem self-luminous. Now, different people have different degrees of this. And some people might have it just, around people or living things. Some people have it on concrete walls. And some people have it on everything. But there's some change that occurs in the visual system like this. And when someone tells us, I've had that change, we know that they've transitioned. And it's persistent. It's not like flickering in and out, or they're not like, I had this for a couple of minutes or something, right? It's there all the time. We know that they've transitioned into location 5. Location 6 takes that a step further. Again, these deeper pieces of that individualized sense of self are falling away, and they were bound up with oftentimes very hardcore, deep sensory processes: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, even motor processes, the ability to move your arms, stuff like that. And people will go through sensory glitches in location 6. They'll report periods of paralysis or partial paralysis, for instance, where it's like some piece of them fell away. And that piece was basically coming into creation in their childhood about the same time that they were learning to move an arm, right? And when that piece fell away, unfortunately, it also fell away that they knew how to move their left arm or whatever, right? And they kind of got to spend some time relearning to use their left arm. Now, oftentimes, these are very quick glitches and the system reforms very rapidly. It might be just, a few seconds or a few hundred milliseconds even. But other times people will, it'll be a couple of weeks before their system relearns to do something, before their sense of smell has returned and a way that's doesn't seem weird and is usable, or that they can, use their arm. So it's actually kind of dangerous because people can full on just be paralyzed. And if they don't have someone around them, that is obviously literally physically dangerous. And so people, before they go to these later locations, I think it's very fortunate people can only seem to be able to land in location 1 through 4. Because if they could just randomly land into stuff where they could be paralyzed for weeks, that's obviously not going to kill them. But people, I think, need to think very carefully as they're about whether they really, really want to go to these later places and whether they have the support systems in place to do that safely. Perception gets flatter at each one of these. So at 4, your perception gets a lot flatter. Especially you can see it visually, perception wise. At 5, it gets flatter still. 6, it gets flatter still. 7, it's kind of maximum flatness. Traditions have called it things like the flatness absolute and, things like that. It's, other people have noticed it and given terms for these things. And you often don't notice that flatness happening until you start coming back to earlier locations. And then you're like, you can't believe how flat your visual perception had become. So these are just changes. These are types of changes. You start to get more accurate intuition. You start to get some of the more PK psychic type things. Lester Levinson, your mentor, your early mentor, would do all kinds of crazy stuff, lose weight in an instant or fix his back in an instant or all these types of things, those are all kind of later location things oftentimes.
Yes. Cool. And so that was very helpful, I think, to everybody to hear that.
How does this jive with you and how you think about this and what you've noticed in people? And, do you see
Well,
does it make
you know,
sense? Does it?
yes and no. To me, there's two things. One is whatever feels progressive to me is still part of the dream or the story. Any sense of progression or measurability is still part of the dream or the story, because there's I don't know why, it just appears that way. On the other hand, having done this for decades, you can see that people, until there's no longer someone creating, there's no longer anyone there to create a story, their story, and there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, even the story is perfect. The story is just what's apparently happening. So when I work with people, I don't really take the time. I'm amazed at all the time and energy we put into creating this model, because it's beautiful. It's totally beautiful, but I don't even really focus on that. It's just wherever this apparent person is presenting, what happens spontaneously is words or actions or something energetic happens to use your model to help them shift to what you to a higher location, as you would put it. And with me, it's completely spontaneous. I don't even most of the time know what I'm doing, because it doesn't feel like I'm doing anything. That's just what happens. Right. And it definitely feels like for most people who come to me, at least, they're pretty consistently very quickly, pretty consistently at level 1 through 3. And there's a small percentage that are consistently at location 4, but that's a much smaller percentage. And in fact, the more I've been talking about what you call location 4, the less people are that excited about it. I was, for a while, I taught mostly just about what you call the first 3 locations, and people were pretty enthusiastic about all that. Yeah, it was fun. It was great. And now that there's been much more explaining and pointing, it's not really explaining because you can't explain it, but pointing at location 4 and beyond, the interest level has actually gone down.
Yeah, totally.
So what I need to do often is I need to balance the earlier locations and hinting that there's actually much more than that. And it's sometimes a balancing act. And again, even that happens spontaneously, although I actually have to restrain myself to some degree to not get too lost in what you would call location 4 and beyond.
Yeah, right. I understand.
Because again, Lester wanted me to reach a bigger audience. Generally, people generally, it's a very small subset of people who are interested in location 4 and beyond.
Yeah.
Even most of the people on the spiritual path, they're not really interested in that.
No.
And
in fact, they're scared of it often.
Oh, yes, often.
And it can prevent them from deepening. If they know about it, sometimes it can prevent them from deepening further, even in 1 through 3.
Yes.
Because they're worried, like, what if I accidentally slip over into that horrible sounding 4 thing? No emotions.
Oh,
my God.
But what's interesting? I don't know where this fits into your paradigm, but what I've found for a lot of people is and again, we're using the term people loosely, is that there can be a freedom with emotion. Maybe that's what you're talking about, the humanistic, you called it I don't remember,
like the path of humanity.
Well, right.
Yeah, the path of humanity.
A lot of people end up, instead of being devoid of emotion, devoid of a filter for emotion, so that they're just completely open, and emotion, there's no one owning any emotion.
Right.
Not an absence of anything. There's a full presence of everything and nothing. And but anyway, but that's a subtlety maybe. But at any rate, so that's based on everything you said, that's how I would describe it. And then the tools that we teach are designed to, in your paradigm, to deepen into whatever level is appropriate. And again, I don't distinguish between any of them at all. Because honestly, I've heard about your work for a long time, and I knew there were levels, and I thought that was fascinating. But this is the first time I've heard an explanation of it.
Yeah, for sure. I think oftentimes in fundamental well-being, there's people who are interested in kind of a taxonomy, and then there are people who aren't interested in taxonomy. And oftentimes, especially people who are very mental, they're very hesitant to go into anything that looks like a taxonomy again, because they're sort of like they're like, I don't really want to reactivate my mind and think about there being different categories of experience or anything like that. I just want it to sort of just be what it is.
Right.
And so that's a subgroup, two subgroupings that we see within the people who are interested in this type of thing.
Yes. So what's been after doing this for 20 years, what's been happening there?
Sure. So I obviously got into this completely selfishly, right? It was a completely selfish endeavor. I was just trying to make myself the happiest person alive, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, that type A person seems to be gone at this point. I don't really think like that anymore. Very early on, I noticed that there seemed to be, I would say, biases in the subject population. Mm-hmm. And it concerned me as a researcher. I began to feel very early on in the research a sense of obligation to the research itself. I realized that it hadn't really been done. I started to realize, nobody had really done it in any degree and whatever. And so I kind of a sense of responsibility took over. And I actually chose not to transition until I was at a point where I felt like the research data was solid enough that if I just, went crazy, or I started telling everybody, look, location 5 of where it's at, everything else is not real, or something like that, that people would just, point to the data. They'd be like, okay, well, we'll just sort of roll Jeffrey into a corner, be nice to him, he's a very sweet person, and then just ignore everything that comes out of his mouth and look at the data. Right. So I tried to basically put off any progress on my own until I really felt that the data spoke for itself. There were not other collaborators that would keep it going, and all of that. And so that really took it up to 2009 or so. We were doing the neuroscience stuff, beginning the neuroscience stuff. And by the end of 2009, I really felt like it had reached that point. And so for me, I just then really just sort of just softened into it. I mean, I put up a bunch of walls to it to protect myself from sliding over into it, and just took down those walls basically and allowed myself to slide into it. And then, however many years later, location 2 and then 3 and then 4, and I've gone very far out at this point. So, yeah.
Right. Good.
And I'm mostly fluid. I did what most people that go to later locations do, which is, had my life fall apart because I wasn't able to really be, socially adept per se anymore, or whatever else. And, I've noticed in the research, other people have followed that same path where they've just kept going and going and going and going. And we all seem to think that we're going to be smarter than the other people, and that's not going to happen to us. But it did, of course. I didn't turn out to be smarter than anybody else and more capable than anybody else that followed that path or whatever. And my life just, went through some very hard times where people thought, I was crazy in a way,
Yes.
And all of that. And it hurt my reputation. And, I definitely didn't do much for me being good at investing money, and, keeping wealth built up,
Yes.
and things like that. Right. And so eventually I just realized, enough people sort of talked some sense into me, and got me to, look more objectively about where this was leading in my life and how it probably wasn't going to be good. And I reevaluated, and I started to sort of turn back. And then I became fluid across I would say that was probably location 7, where that happens to most people. It's really where it happened to me. I've been out to 8 and 9. But location 7 was really sort of a major turning point for me. I turned back and I worked more on fluidity and optimizing my life, trying to get my system to sort of be in an ideal spot within fundamental well-being for whatever I was doing in the moment. And then from more of a safe, more put together life again place, started to explore, later locations in ways that made sense. Being sure to come back. And so I think we are a research project, and so I don't pretend to know what's right for anybody else. All we have is data and tendencies in the data and stuff like that. So I would just say right now that turned out to be what was the case for me. I was talking to some mutual friends of ours in Sedona yesterday. I don't know if we should say who it is because I'm going to tell a little story about them. And they're good about, they're really comfortable with where they're at. One of them is at location 3, for instance. They have no real desire to go and explore further later locations. Yes. Their life is wonderful. They're very happy with where they're at. They're spiritual teachers.
That's very common.
Impact that they want.
In fact, most of the people out there teaching
too,
are like that. Yes.
I'm fine if people want to stay at location 1. If location 1 is really what's best for someone's life and they're really happy there, it's great. We're not a pedal to the metal, or there's no right spot, or, we don't have any of that. We just have tendencies in the data that we talk about.
Yeah. Cool. So, let's see. We actually went past where I thought the amount of time we were going to spend, but I thought this was really fun. So
yeah, me too. This was great.
You're fun to listen to, and I've never really heard it described the way you've described it. And cool. Again, the fun thing about this this whole exploration is that there isn't one right way.
No,
there is just what is. To quote you, exactly. And which is something I say a lot too, and it shows up differently in every body-mind mechanism, and at the same time, it's all just one unified energy. No matter what, that's just what's there. This boundless, timeless, spaceless beingness, and none of those terms do any justice to it. And it's been fascinating. When I started doing these podcasts, I was part of what I was trying to do is point out the commonality that we're all, even if we're just trying to help someone make more money or have a better relationship, it's all beautiful. It's all just what is. And so this has been fun. This has been really fun. So do you have anything that you want to leave people with, or do you have a website you want to refer people to, or anything like that?
Our research website is non-symbolic.org. One thing that people that listen, especially that listen to this podcast, might want to do is see if they're actually in fundamental well-being and don't know it.
Right.
Because, of course, the transition that happens reduces your self-referential thought. And even famous teachers have gone years without realizing that they transitioned, and earlier in their
Yes.
life, stuff like that.
Yes,
And so I think people don't realize how common a phenomenon that really is. If they go to non-symbolic.org, it's not on the main page. I should probably put it on the main page, but somewhere there's a page that talks about how to figure out where you're at.
Uh-huh.
And on that page, there's a survey that people can take. And it's going to be a very academically sound. It's not like, is your favorite color blue? Oh, great. You're a rainbow pony, right? It's like the question that I asked earlier, like when you look out, does it seem like there's something in your head looking out? Or does it seem like everything is, it's real questions, but there's only like 10 or so questions. So it's a relatively short survey. People should really think about the answers to each one of those questions. And then at the end, it'll basically tell them where we think they're at based on this model. And so that could be, I think, a fun thing, for listeners. I think it's going to be a lot of people listening to this today who are in fundamental well-being, who think they're still a seeker. Right. And that's just not a good thing, because if you think you're still trying to get through the door, the things you're doing are things people do to get through the door. Whereas if you're already through the door, you should be doing things that you should be doing if you're already through the door, like taking off your coat and hanging it up and settling into the space that you find yourself in and things like that. Right. And so I think that's I think the most helpful thing probably that we could have people do,
All right, cool. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jeffery Martin. You can learn more about Jeffery at drjeffreymartin.com. That's drjefferymartin.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe so you'll have immediate access to future episodes. Please give us a 5-star rating and share it with the people you care about. If you'd like to learn more about my work, my mentor Lester Levinson's work, and the Sedona method, please visit www.sedona.com. As you explore our site, you'll learn the key to lasting happiness, success, peace, and emotional well-being. We have books, courses, events, and plenty of free material to explore. Again, go to sedona.com. That's sedona.com. Thank you for being here, and we'll catch you in the next episode of Letting Go and the Greatest Secret.